As my next guest has pointed out, there is a concerted effort to instil fear into British politics. The march last week outside Parliament, it was the director of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, Ben Jamal, who told the crowd before him, "There is a reason why Labour today is twisting in the wind. There is a reason for the chaos descending behind you, and that's because MPs are feeling the pressure. They're becoming worried. The culture of fear is here." As early as November, there were hundreds of activists protesting outside a Labour MP's office in East London. We saw the vandalism of the Shadow Welsh Secretary Jo Stevens' office, with posters put up suggesting she had blood on her hands. We then saw targeted protests at the office for the member for Sheffield Brightside and Hillsborough, Jill Furness. There's the member for Bournemouth East, Tobias Elwood, targeted his own family home. The member for Ilford North, Wes Streeting, and the member for Oxford East, Annalise Dodds. We've seen recent disruption in London, Edinburgh, Bedford and in Staffordshire. We're now seeing more death threats to politicians and candidates too. And of course, this all culminated in the decision from the Speaker last week to break with convention in an attempt to allow MPs to escape the wrath of the mob. Speaking to the Andrew Marr show last night, the mother of the House, Harriet Harman, suggested a solution to the fear MPs are feeling now.
Harriet Harman, who is the mother of the House, has not been interested in the safety of MPs for the last 48 hours, but for a lot longer than that. And Harriet, you have a proposal for how Parliament might start to look at and resolve this big problem.
Well, I think we need a mechanism to address all the conflicting issues that need to be balanced here. And I think the right mechanism is something called a Speakers' Conference. One of the things that I think could come out of a Speakers' Conference is an agreement that actually we could go back to hybrid again, which is that sometimes MPs could speak in the chamber, sometimes they could speak from their constituency. They could sometimes vote through the division lobbies, or they could sometimes vote online.
Remote voting would be surrendering to the mob, hiding away in the corner, latibulating, too frightened to do the job would be the ultimate defeat. Margaret Thatcher, after the Brighton bomb, showed the virtue of carrying on. When our way of life is under threat, we must not change our way of life. We cannot capitulate to it. That is how the mob wins. The police must use the powers they already have to crack down on the mob's intimidation. Members of Parliament must take some share of responsibility for this chaos. As I said yesterday, what we are seeing in our streets is the combination of uncontrolled and unintegrated mass migration and radical Islamist ideology. But mass migration has been a policy imposed by legislators over the past 25 years or so. The appropriate response to this is not to pretend we are immune to the consequences of our policies and abandon our democratic freedoms. We must face them head on, crack down on criminality, and most importantly, protect liberty, the rule of law, and justice. As ever, let me know your thoughts, mailmog@gbnews.com. I'm particularly delighted to be joined today by the Mail on Sunday columnist, Dan Hodges, who works with the very distinguished Brendan Carlin at the Mail on Sunday.
Indeed.
Dan, thank you for joining me. You had a really interesting piece on Sunday suggesting that we have got to get much tougher and that we have to recognise that the liberal idea of thinking anyone can protest whenever they like is allowing cover for the mob. What should the government be doing to enforce the law?
Well, I think there are a number of things. Firstly, you touched on it. Obviously, we're seeing protests overtly targeting MPs at their own homes. That has to stop. You've touched on the issue of MPs being targeted at their offices. That has to stop. But also, I think more broadly, we are seeing now, and we have been seeing for several months now, marches through the streets of London which are not only, I think, leading to the sort of intimidation of MPs that we've seen over the last couple of weeks, but also is directly leading to the intimidation of one of London's oldest minority communities. And you will know this because I know this. We all have friends who will personally tell us from the Jewish community that on Saturdays they are no longer prepared to go and are no longer prepared to allow their families to go into central London. And at that moment, a line has been crossed. Obviously, we all accept there has to be freedom of protest and freedom of speech, but that has to be balanced with the liberty of people to go about their daily lives. And that balance is not being met now.
And that's the issue, isn't it? That balance, that you don't protect your values ultimately by abandoning them. And freedom of speech and the right to protest are very ancient values in this country. But they're also ones that historically have been abused and have turned into riots, and then you've had to impose law and order. But how do you get this balance right? Is it actually that wrong to protest outside an MP's office? It's clearly worse to protest outside an MP's home.
It is worse, but you've got to remember we're not just solely talking about MPs. We're talking about the people who work for the MPs. We're talking about people who are obviously trying to access the service of MPs. You're all well aware that these offices don't sit in isolation. They're obviously usually around other businesses, residential areas. And the question is, are people seeking to persuade? Are people seeking to inform? Or are people seeking to intimidate? And I think it is quite clear now that people are seeking to intimidate MPs into a particular way of thinking, a specific way of voting. And frankly, as we saw last week, it's working. I was speaking to one of your colleagues who literally said to me, he turned up at the House of Commons on that morning and had decided he was going to vote in a particular way because he was scared.
He was going to abstain, you said in your article.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was going to abstain because he was scared for his own physical safety and the physical safety of his family. Now, again, when we get to that point, a line hasn't just been crossed, a line has been left 20 miles behind because that is not a functioning democracy at that point.
But isn't there an extent to which politicians have to show some backbone, that you are an MP? You can't just say, I'm going to abstain because there's a mob. You report the mob to the police and the police have a duty to act. MPs can't cower away in the corner. It's why I so dislike what Harriet Harman suggested, that people shouldn't come into Parliament, they should vote from home. That's a terrible defeat, isn't it?
I agree with what you said about Harriet Harman. That obviously can't be something that was done. I think, obviously, it was a mistake last week what Lindsay Hoyle did. But I am also chary of this idea that, for MPs, putting up with the threat of physical violence is the price of doing business. I mean, remember, MPs, this is not an abstraction. MPs have seen two of their colleagues recently murdered just conducting, in the course of just conducting their ordinary constituency business. And again, in a democracy, MPs should not be having to look over their shoulders every time they walk out of the House of Commons because of how they've walked through the division lobbies.
No, that must be right. But it's a question, to go back to your earliest answer, of balance. So if you say there shouldn't be a protest outside an MP's office, can it be in the high street near the MP's office? Where do you allow the protest to take place?
Yes, I think that's the point. I think you can allow a protest to take place where it is clear that people are simply expressing a view about a particular issue. They are obviously free to lobby their MP in the way that anybody else is able to do. This idea, I mean, again, I think this is one of the problems, this idea if you can get a big enough collective mass that it forms into a mob and it can then, as I say, physically intimidate somebody, and that obviously gives it sort of an inbuilt advantage, I think that's something that we have to remove from our politics now.
And until relatively recently, marches when Parliament was sitting were not allowed to take place close to Parliament.
I'm not entirely sure when that changed or why. I think one of the problems is, I would guess why it happened. I would guess it happened because I would guess, as we're seeing consistently, and this is another problem, that the police are saying we can't effectively police these events. And I think that's another thing. I mean, as I said in my article, we've now got a situation where the police, senior police officers, I'm not criticising the rank and file anyway, but the senior police officers are no longer acting as custodians of the law, they're acting as glorified stewards, and they have this view that if an event takes place without mass violence, without mass criminal disorder, then that's a good event. Well, that can't be the threshold.
Particularly if they're not going to enforce the law when it's broken right in front of them. So Martin Daubney, who presents for GB News, had eggs thrown at him, hit him, and liquid thrown over him, with police right next to him, seeing the perpetrator, who did nothing about it, which seems to me a complete abnegation of the police's duty. On the other hand, if the police start arresting people, are they worried that it gets entirely out of control and it goes from being an intimidating protest to being a riot, which obviously is much harder to control?
But I think you just put your finger on it. Once we get to the point where the police are taking the decision, we are not going to enforce the rule of law because the mob is too big, we will be outnumbered by the mob, again, it could create physical disorder. then by definition, we are literally handing over the streets to the mob. And it's a licence for anyone to say, if we get enough of a critical mass, we will be able to ignore the law because the police will not dare to intervene. And we've literally seen that. We've seen that. We've seen on several occasions the Metropolitan Police saying to protesters, I think the most recent one was, you can't march down Whitehall. They made a very public statement, we will not let people march down Whitehall. You wake up the next day and the protesters are on Whitehall, openly glorifying the fact that they've been able to defy the police.
Thank you very much. It is a terribly serious problem, but thank you, Dan.